My friends, this is John Edward Willey, and I'm taking a stroll through the middle part of Midtown, thinking aloud as I do, this time about the penultimate philosophical question, which is that of free will versus determinism. To some philosophers, this isn't really even a real question, and to many, it's in fact a boring question, given that it's the most fundamental question of all. In fact, I have many nostalgic feelings and memories about conversations or arguments that I've had that have sometimes lasted all night long about the question of free will and determinism. And over time, I've taken both positions. That is, I've defended the idea that we have free will, that we can make choices, that we have possibilities that we can recognize and live up to. On the other hand, I've also affirmed determinism, which is the idea that illusion at best, freedom at best is an illusion, and that we are in fact determined by states that we can't comprehend, but are compelling us, determining us to be what we are and make the choices that we are. But of course, this is one in a series of videos I've been doing about fundamental philosophical questions. And as I've said, the first videos were about the questions of truth and how we can think about knowledge and how we can learn to think philosophically. But these videos I've been making recently about language and about consciousness and knowledge are far more interesting. And this one, I think, is the most interesting of all, given that it's irresolvable. That is, we cannot resolve it. And it lives as a kind of unanswerable question, which we are living through. And so, as such, it's not merely an abstract question. I think the question of free will and determinism is embedded in the existential choices that we make, not merely every once in a while. This isn't a question of heroic moments and whether we were determined or had free will, but a more day-to-day subliminal level at which we are experiencing something which is contradictory to what we know. The experience we have, or often have, or sometimes have, is that of making choices, of having free will. Yet this contradicts everything that we know in regards to science or economics or thinking at all. In fact, thinking to function as such must presume a certain level of determination. And so the question here is, why limit the determination? Why not grant an all-engulfing, all-encompassing determination as obliterating any possibility of free will? You know, traditionally there's sort of three responses to the question of whether we are determined by things or whether we have free will. And those are called, believe it or not, since philosophers are often really bad at coming up with good names for things, these are determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. And determinism, of course, reflects what it implies, which is the possibility that we are so determined that we cannot cast blame or praise on anyone, including ourselves. That is, no one has any control over what they're doing, and that includes us. But of course, that pulls out the rug from beneath the most fundamental concepts that we have. You know, we live in a world where, for better or worse, we assume with other people that particular categories of thinking exist because we must assume that they exist. That is, for our legal system or our ethics to operate, we have to assume that people can make choices, that they can be blamed for the choices they made or held in praise for the choices that they made. But even more than that, the very identity that you live with, the very structure of your world, is shaped by what I've suggested to be a kind of imaginary proposition, which is the proposition of freedom. Now, of course, many of us are aware of determination, and many people are more than sensitive to contextualization and to the degree to which we have to think in very subtle ways when we're considering the nature to which we blame people or grant them a certain amount of grace. But the compatibilism is in fact the most common point of view, which is the idea that we can have our cake and eat it too, meaning that many people want to bifurcate their conceptualization of experience. And I think that this is unnecessary. And not only that, but that it's intellectually shallow. And what I mean is that there's a superficial kind of compatibilism, which wants to more or less willy-nilly, without realizing it, but acting totally arbitrarily, determines determination or grants free will, depending on one's own desires or one's own thinking. And what this means is that when we consider ourselves, I think that's the touchstone, that's the starting point for this examination, which is self-examination. But also when we look into others, we have to pay attention to the degree to which people are within themselves, without their own awareness, more often than not, a complete mess of, as I've said, arbitrary associations and connections in ideas which justify one thing in one context and not another thing in the other context. So what I mean is that there's a very superficial approach to this question, even if it's conscious of the theoretical question at hand. And that's one that wants to ignore or underplay the actual implications of the question. Because I don't really think that the question of free will or determination upon examination grants any basis for free will whatsoever. So we're left in a kind of position of having to assume theoretically that no one in any place and no thing in any place in any time can be anything other than what it is. And so this negates what's called counterfactuals. This pure determination, which refuses to play the game of suggesting that, oh, we have free will sometimes we do not, is one that is a blanketed determinism, which in many ways is precisely the kind of theory that many people in religious and Buddhistic thinking are seeking, which is the desire to eradicate the need for making choices. However, if one is driven by the need to have that kind of claim, if one is driven by the need to release oneself from having to make choices, this is intellectually unserious. Because what I'm pressing is the idea that we have to take this idea as seriously as we can and push it as far as we can. The idea being that free will is an illusion, or that if it exists, it itself is determined by alternatives that are outside of the awareness of the person who is determining. And, you know, when we look at the defense of free will, I think what we find is something very interesting, because I'm not defending free will or determinism. I'm really trying to make a case as well as I can for each before moving on. And I think the case for free will is interesting because what it begins with is the experience of free will. And so my own little contribution to this discussion is the very idea that whether we decide on determinism or free will is actually perhaps a temperamental decision that we make, whether we privilege our own experience or whether we privilege theory. Because although determinism, I think, is rationally justified not only as being partially true but fully true, it in itself is predicated upon the idea that the truth is outside of us, that we are being determined. The thing that, if a person is thinking theoretically, ought to be said about free will is that one is not blindly affirming free will, and you're not defending free will because you just have to believe in it. That's the case that a lot of determinists often make in regards to people who believe in free will. They say that you just psychologically or existentially have to believe that you can make choices in order to have any sense of stability and to live a coherent kind of life. But I think that this is mistaken, because what the person who defends free will is doing is wanting to begin with the very built-in experience of making choices that is a part of the structure of being human being. And so what I think we're doing is wrestling with a starting point. And starting points are the trickiest thing in philosophical speculation. And the starting point which is often invisible to the speculator, determines the outcome of their decision regarding whether they believe in determinism or free will. And so I think that people who believe in free will, or people who believe in determinism in the extremist sense, are preferable to those who are what I called superficial compatibilists, meaning that we cannot simply dismiss this problem by attempting to not contend with its underlying implications. Because as a part of this philosophical project that I'm on, one thing that I'm on guard against is anti-intellectualism. And so it's one thing to recognize Wittgenstein and Heidegger and what they have to say with the entirety of the philosophical project perhaps being mistaken or being bonk. That's not the same thing as the kind of kick the rock, laugh at philosophers kind of attitude that a lot of people have about these questions not really having any relevance. Therefore, I believe in compatibilism because clearly science tells us that we are animals and we are determined, but I also need to believe in my own freedom, and therefore I sort of play a game with myself, which is what I'm hinting at as being the messiness of being a human being. And it's not that we can really cleanse ourselves of this messiness. This is a part of our human nature. In fact, I don't call it human nature, I call it the human wild. Because I think that what we are doing in wrestling with the wild as civilized beings, and in fact with being wild beings as we are, which are in many ways playing a serious game of being civilized, I think what we have to recognize is that we are able to offer ourselves the kind of clarity and the kind of unity in thinking that is extremely helpful when it can exist, through thinking carefully about these rampant contradictions and schisms that exist all throughout my thinking and all throughout your thinking. Because although it's one thing to admit that being a human being is far more complicated than most so-called rational or coherent people want to believe, it's another thing to recognize that a part of this project of being human has to do with a certain degree of sincerity, a certain degree of dignity, which is won through a serious investigation of these kind of fundamental puzzles and fundamental contradictions that live at the very heart of our existence. And the free will determinism question is, as I've said, the perennial philosophical question, given that it's not only at the height of abstraction and at the height of the tradition, it's also deeply embedded into our interior lives. Because it has to be remembered that for us to blame somebody or to blame ourselves, that is to have shame or to have anger, is an expression of a belief in free will, that things could be other than what they are, that people can be other than what they are. That is what goes along with believing in this kind of free will. Now imagine for a second that it's mistaken, that people don't have free will or much less free will than we want to believe. Then to what degree can we really hold other people accountable? To what degree can we blame anybody? Or to what degree can we blame ourselves or have shame? And yet this contends with the very experience of choice that we have so far as we're in a kind of healthy state of mind. And so it could be said that perhaps the possibility of affirming free will has a lot to do with the kind of surplus energy that's needed not only to imagine it, but to enact it. That surplus energy having to do with the kind of rare thing which is leisure, the rare thing which is freedom from the overwhelming push and pressures of life. So it could be said that free will is a function of a kind of discipline that we give ourselves in lieu of wrestling with the cognitive and physical contradictions and pressures of life. Because I do not play that superficial game of randomly believing in free will or determination, except insofar as by being human, I'm forced into a position of playing that game. So I don't see myself in this own dialectic wrestling that I'm partaking in as being somehow suspended above or free from this question. In fact, I think this is what makes this so ultra fascinating. And although I've never answered the question, having argued about it since the age of 19, which is far longer than I would want to admit, I can tell you that without having certainty about the questions of whether I'm determined or have free will, the very questions itself animate the experiences that I've had year after year of trying to make choices, of trying to exercise my own courage, of trying to exercise my own will. And so I think that a part of what happens in the philosophical life is that although these questions appear unrelated or disconnected from life, they in fact play a pivotal role in comprehending the very cognitive difficulty and richness which is a part of being alive. And so there's something about the questions themselves which allow us to better comprehend the vast array of positions and possible thoughts that other people can have or that reality might represent. Meaning that if one wants to enter the basements of life, if one wants to become an engineer, a conceptual engineer, and wrestle with the architecture of the house of being, then it would behoove you to begin thinking deeply and sincerely about the question of whether you are free or whether you are determined. And what is ultra fascinating is that when you consider the layers upon layers of determination, meaning that the economics, the history that go into making you who you are, as well as the psychological, brain-based things that go into making you who you are and the choices that you made, which have to do with the very chemical codes which are making you who you are. And when you consider the nature of the situation that you're born into, not only in your time and space in being in this particular world, but being in a world at all, and being in a metaphysical situation wherein you consider the litany of events which have cascaded into this very moment, which is a vast unfolding determination, beginning with, from what we can tell in cosmogony, to be the Big Bang. Then one can see that to believe in free will, that is to believe that you have a choice or that you should hold yourself accountable or that you're guilty or that other people are guilty, this becomes laughable. This becomes a complete joke. And yet, when you are not thinking theoretically, which I think is fundamental to thinking theoretically, given that theory is not the same thing as existence, that philosophy is not the same thing as life, then you can see that there is a problem with wanting to wash away the possibility of free will, which is that we have this glimmering experience of making choices, and you can dismiss the act of making choices as simply being an illusion, right? You can dismiss the possibility that other people's lives are actually at stake based on the way that you live your life in a very indirect way. But that doesn't mean that it's not the case. And it doesn't mean that in allowing yourself this kind of grace, which is often self-granted, but might be the case, which has to do with not being able to be anything other than what you are, or other people not being anything other than what they are, you're negating the very possibility of possibly making a choice. So there's something that one is always eluding, and is eluding oneself in the exploration of this kind of question. And not only that, as someone who's sort of had a working class life, more to speak, more or less, I was never sequestered in any kind of institution or academic world or a world of safety or constant leisure. I've been around people in a million different situations who come from a million different backgrounds. And the thing that I've learned is that you have to always begin with where a person is at. Like, you're basically wasting your time, or you're not even talking to them, or not even having a real human interaction, so long as you're not actually looking at the specificity of what another person is, which is a part of having a conversation. And even when one is not having conversations, which in fact one rarely is, one is more often than not living a human relation with others, not a purely theoretical relation, but a human relation where, as a function of awareness, as a function of attention to the nominal sublimity of another person's world, one recognizes that the degree to which determination and freedom ought to be argued often have to do with the actuality of the situation the person is in. And what I mean is this: that often we discover people who are overwhelmed by the need to make something of themselves. I meet people who are overwhelmed with the pressures of needing to make choices, of needing to improve themselves. I myself have been caught up in this kind of 24-hour a day, 365 days a year kind of self-improvement quest. I have been caught up in this dual drive to not only understand and comprehend all of reality and history in myself, but also to exercise control and mastery over myself. And what that led me into was a complete kind of paralysis. What I mean is that believing that I had total free will and that I could make choices that would change my life completely, I led myself into a state of complete paralysis, meaning that I couldn't breathe, I couldn't function, I couldn't think clearly at all. And it's not that I changed my mind overnight, but as I began to consider, especially through conversations with really great people that I began to know, the degree to which I was determined, I began to feel a kind of freedom that I've never felt before. Because prior to that, I had resisted all forms of determination. When I was a teenager, I was told that I should be on medication, and I rejected that in the name of humanism and its emphasis upon free will. And from the ages of 15 and a half to about 26 years of age, I only believed in free will. In fact, I didn't think about anything other than the future that I was facing and the choices that I was making. And although that made me in many ways the person that I am, I think it also possibly could have destroyed me. It could have killed me completely. And so I'm lucky in that I discovered a kind of grace. Grace meaning that I discovered a kind of peace and sanity in discovering in biological ways and socioeconomic ways, but also in metaphysical and many other personal ways that I did not have the kind of freedom that I thought I had, which is a totalized freedom. I began to find that I began to actually, contrary to what I thought would happen, I began to understand things far more deeply. Because what I began to discover is what is almost an alchemical principle in philosophy, which is that in order to breathe out, you have to breathe in. Like, in order to understand presence, you have to understand absence. And so absence as a precondition of presence is a way in which I began to understand that there is no totalized metaphysical certainty one can have about either being determined or by being free. Because I had wrestled also with a lot of other, you could call them astrological people, you could call them Marxist, you could call them fatalist. I had wrestled also in those 10 years with a lot of people who had wanted to tell me, still think for false reasons, for illogical reasons, that I didn't have the kind of freedom that I'd believed that I had, given that I am a kind of indirect, untimely child of the Florentine Renaissance, meaning that the kind of existential fire that keeps me alive isn't the same thing as the reductive kind of rationalism that I see in people like Sam Harris. Although I often agree with a lot of what he says, he seems rather abstract and distant from the body in the way that Boccaccio and others perhaps are not. And not only that, but their very tragic conception of free will, which isn't the same thing as this kind of abstract totalized free will, is still something that moves me forward. Yet all of this is tempered by, is shaped by a deep critical awareness of the degree to which freedom is not, in fact, a possible belief, given that to believe in freedom at all is the same thing as believing in miracles, and to believe in one miracle is to believe in them all. So one is facing a set of options of which there really is, in fact, no way out. And as I've said, we have to begin with where people are at. And when I begin with where I was at, it was through my own investigation into all kinds of other things, whether it has to do with Robert Saplansky, who's a professor at Stanford, and who has a lot of great lectures and a lot of great books, like the book Behave, about the nature of determination in human life. And he makes probably the most brilliant case for determinism possible. But that, however, went in hand with an investigation of other forms of determination. One of those being Immanuel Kant's transcendental deduction. That is, the possibility of the synthetic a priori in philosophical jargon means the possibility of determinations which are outside of our ability to think. And for Kant, what this meant was that we cannot think outside of space and time. So space and time, as an inherent part of our experience, is something that we cannot free ourselves from. And I think that that in itself represents one of many other discoveries that one can then make from that point of view about one's own determination. Meaning that when one begins with Darwin, when one begins with the recognition of our animal nature, of the almost unbreakable lust, the sort of unquenchable desire that we have to pursue things that are impossible. And when you consider recent elections and the nature of electors as well as the electees, one finds a dissipation of the possibility of free will, especially one that is connected to rational agency. These are things that don't merely have to do with the kind of skeptical, critical considerations one might have about other people, but about oneself. In my own examination of myself as a human being, not merely in a philosophical way, but as a way of paying attention to myself, I'm often astonished at how lacking in free will I am, at how not only irrational and compulsive I am, but how little choice I actually exercise. When I consider the degree to which what I call grace is perhaps a kind of covert laziness, and when I consider the degree to which I'm often eluding my own ideals and constantly failing to live up to my own ambitions, when I see the ludicrous failure to which I am in lieu of the grandiosity, the grandiose ambitions that I've had, I cannot help but feel that rug pulled out from beneath me regarding the possibility of believing in free will. And yet, when I return to what I consider to be a sincere, dignified, phenomenological attempt to look directly at my experience, which is something that I've just brought up in lieu of it pointing at the impossibility of believing in free will, considering what a mess I am and other people are, in a sincere way I confront what is to me most mysterious, what is most strange about experience, which is that we have choices, that we are thrown into this world. That is true. We are cast into this world without choosing to be here, but we are cast into this world in the structure of care. And that's Martin Heidegger's phrase, care. And I think Martin Heidegger, in fact, along with Wittgenstein, represents a profound precipice through which this traditional question of free will and determination is reworked into another kind of grasping. Because I don't think that Heidegger is merely abstract in this regard. I think that early Heidegger is the most existential of all philosophers. And it's not merely that care, that is concern, that is the basis of our choices as a structure of existence, is something that we choose. It's something that we are determined into. So we are determined to be free. That's not merely a coy paradox. That's actually what, when one thinks about it, is the very nature of our wildness, of our being. And it could be that free will is an illusion, but to say that is to give primacy to the speculative and the theoretical. That is, it is to give primacy to understanding as opposed to, no, that is, sorry, I misspoke. It's to give primacy to knowledge as opposed to understanding. Because what I mean to say is that understanding is a way of thinking about the way that we exist in the world is something that is wrestling with alternatives. It's wrestling with choices. However, understanding isn't the same thing as knowledge. And I hope to explain these distinctions further in later videos. But knowledge itself, as a primarily abstract phenomenon, is predicated upon determination. But the way that knowledge is used in reality in a pragmatic way operates through a kind of understanding that is always outside of our periphery, orienting the way that this knowledge is used. And so I think that there's a creaturely thing within us which predates what we think of as our minds, which in fact is helping us navigate this world. And so it's almost laughable to even think about philosophical questions as having any kind of status at all, given that we seem to be driven by mechanisms, or that's a really bad word, but we're driven by being an organism that has existed for millions of years and which is well attuned to the complexity of the world. And this fits in with the very neurological kind of phenomenological experience of freedom that we have. Meaning that what is called epiphenomenalism is often understood to be the idea that experience is sort of this glittering effect of the world, and that it's actually just this sort of superficial thing which doesn't mean anything, meaning that your thoughts, your self-awareness, and your feelings, and your imagination, everything that we take self-consciousness to be, is from the epiphenomenal point of view, sort of like the waves that are on the ocean that are just crashing. You know, the waves are not the ocean itself. And so epiphenomenalism is wanting to suggest that the real wealth of our experience is to be discovered in what is outside of the epiphenomenal. But I am wanting to say that the epiphenomenal is narrowly understood, because it is in the epiphenomenal where the brain is wrestling with a never-ending reality. A never-ending meaning that it's a reality that is constantly in flux. So our brains are constantly in flux is something that evolves. Reality is something that evolves. And in this interface is where human intelligibility emerges. But human intelligibility isn't as ancient as we think it is. It's sort of a face that's painted over this underlying act of evolutionary understanding that I've pointed out earlier. But this evolutionary way of understanding is more profound than what we consider to be the epiphenomenal. Because one understands another alchemical point about philosophy, which is that the universal exists in the specific. That is, the general exists in the singular, and the singular exists in the general. Then one can see that to dismiss the experience of freedom of our mental lives as just being a minor outcome of a larger process is to fail to see that the entire process is writ large into the particularity of our experience. And so every choice that you make or do not make is the cosmos itself working itself out, insofar as all these particular points within us and all these particular points outside of us are needing to be understood through a kind of calculus, through a kind of, dare I say, program, which is able to manage the chaos outside and the chaos within in a way that can not merely free itself from pressures, but maximize those pressures so as to animate the possibility of further life. I think that's, in many ways, the best way that I can think about this. But another way that I have found others think about it is that they begin with non-determination. You know, a lot of people begin with quantum physics as they imagine it, not quantum physics even as it is, but these sort of cliched ideas about reality not being determined, therefore free will being a function of this non-determination. But this is a classic mistake philosophically. That is, to attribute free will to pure chaos is to miss what is perhaps most important about freedom, which is the underlying coherency needed to make it possible. And so in investigating what this would even mean, one discovers that simply postulating chaos as being the basis for free will is also ignoring the very experience of free will that we have once again. And it's not that I'm a mere empiricist or a naturalist, but I continually go back to the experience that I have, which I have to assume to be a universal autonomous experience, which is more or less on days when we're feeling pretty good, we're able to make choices. But on other days when we're not feeling good, we feel determined. And we're often running on autopilot in lieu of all of that. And yet, when we attempt to make sense of it in a theoretical sense, we can't in any absolute way. What we do is what I suggested before, which is to play a pointless game of attempting to randomly decide when freedom exists. And yet, this pointless game, ironically, is what the political world is. This is what the judicial and legal system is. And so it's especially haunting when one considers the possibility that people are held accountable for choices they never could have made. And this exists in many ways. And there are numerous thought experiments which can be worked out to point at the very difficulties that we have in not only knowing whether we are determined or others are determined, but even making sense of the very question in lieu of the complexities that we face. And so what I find is that, having thought about this for a long time and being someone that believes in determination insofar it has to do with knowledge itself being based on determinism, but also living in a kind of schism, living in a kind of bifurcated, manifold world where I also, in my own experience, dismiss the theoretical and affirm my free will insofar as I can, even if it's an illusion. I find that I'm in fact wrestling with the nature of philosophy and the theoretical intellectual life itself, because I am always remembering David Hume's line that to be a philosopher, one must first be a human being. And of course, he said one must first be a man. And I don't merely mean to degenderize him, but I think that there is something fundamentally human which comes before being a philosopher. And I think to pull the rug out from beneath the possibility that you might have of making choices, of exercising your courage, of exercising your free will, because it's convenient to believe in what you take to be knowledge, I think that's to thwart, I think it's to negate and to insult your underlying intuitive understanding of what it means to be a human being, which means to believe in choices, not because we know that we have choices, but because we have nothing else that we can do except hitch our lives on a kind of gamble, that there's a kind of gamble that's enacting itself in simply making choices. One never has access to the kind of certainty one wants to have. And so therefore, one never has a safe bet. There's always something dangerous, something that is being risked, not merely in thinking, but in being human. And to wrestle with that is to wrestle with the complexities of this. And yet, what I find to be most freeing, given that I'm not completely obsessed with this question like I used to be, is that when I'm not thinking, the question doesn't really exist. And that's to hint at, again, what I brought up before about life, and about life as awareness, not as self-awareness, but life as a kind of semi-awareness, which is much more ancient and much more creaturely. I find that this experience of free will is coupled with the very possibility that because I don't know what is determining me, I am free to think that I'm free. That is, the freedom to think that you're free is a function of never having or never being able to comprehend the totality of your context or your determination. That is, the very thing that you had sought by not having is precisely the thing that grants you the experience that you now have, which is the experience of making choices in a world whose complexity far outruns the possibility of ever thinking it. And what this means is that we are always able to think that we're free, because we're never aware of what is determining us. It's simply the lack of awareness itself about what is shaping us that allows us to think that there's something within us that's shaping it. And although this appears to be a kind of intellectual trap, it's only that insofar as we're thinking about it as such. Because to think can mean to practice a kind of doubleness. It can mean to attempt to think about, like thinking about. But on a more fundamental level, it can mean what's called simple consciousness itself. It can mean what is sometimes called naive consciousness, which is taken to be perceptual awareness that is not aware of itself as such. And yet this itself, this naive consciousness, is sort of the basis of the richness of human life. The very experiences that we hold on to as being most meaningful, whether in politics or in love, are almost rarely self-aware of themselves. And it is perhaps in this lack of self-awareness that the very experience of being human is most felt. And so it's no wonder that those who wrestle with the complexities of this question in this attempt to sort of understand experience itself find themselves disappearing from experience and living vacuous, empty lives, because regardless of what they attempt to do, they're living a theoretical mental life that isn't exactly the same thing as the experience of freedom that we are seeking. So then the question is, what is the experience of freedom versus a theory of freedom? And perhaps based on what I've suggested about the nature of a simple consciousness, this would be impossible itself. So one is led then to believe perhaps that free will has to do with not thinking, at least not being self-aware, and that so long as we're thinking, we are determined, which is very fascinating, because experience itself, the way that we have a consciousness, is not aware of itself as such. And I don't think it exists in language or in signs. I'm of the belief that semiosis or semiotics emerges from a kind of creaturely understanding which contains the experience of freedom, but this experience itself is perhaps betrayed by the semiotics of the question. And so in not thinking obsessively, I find myself living a much more free life. And yet one cannot live without thinking. That is, one cannot live without wrestling with the difficulty and the tension and the messiness of having to make small choices every day, having to make big choices, and deciding to be somebody rather than allowing yourself to simply let go isn't always going to function, because there does come a time where one must learn how to let go and to be determined. And I think that ability to operate within these modalities, that ability to shift modalities, is in many ways precisely what the dance is all about, if there is such a thing as a dance. So more than anything, I think the question really drives home the kind of exhilarating bewilderment that a person like me can have about the very basic experiences we all have on a day-to-day basis. And I think the question of free will and determinism appears very removed from our lives, but it is a part of our lives. And not only that, it's pivotal that we're able to wrestle with it, because our world depends upon the outcomes to these questions. We, as autonomous beings who are making the world what it is through the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis, are determining that world through the degree to which we either affirm or negate the possibility of free choices. I could talk about this question forever. This question has always been a pivotal part in my own thinking because I could judge other people in lieu of their response to the question. And I think that almost everything else in philosophy is a reformulation of this question. And yet, one's relationship to philosophy, I think, is more important at a certain point than one's response to this question. Because, as I said earlier, a small point, but I think it's an important point, the degree to which you choose to believe in free will or you choose to believe in determination is really a choice as to whether you affirm knowledge as something objective, which exists outside of us, which is predicated upon a never-ending series of events that make us what we are. But if you believe in free will, which even if not true, I think it would behoove you to believe that it were the case in order to have the deepest kind of experience of being human, that in itself is an affirmation of what is increasingly overlooked. In spite of all the obsessions with subjectivity and the narcissism that's rampant in our culture, very few people really affirm or privilege their own bodies, their own experience as being the site of philosophical meaning. And so to affirm that site, to affirm the experience of having this apparent illusion, these apparent alternatives, is to affirm what is without promise. It's to affirm what is without guarantee, because it means to step out and to step on your own. And these reflections are perhaps personal opinions, having less to do with the nature of the question itself. But I think they're also inevitable, and that the sooner a thinking person learns to affirm being human in the most basic sense, the sooner then they can begin thinking at all. And so I'm John Edward Willey, and you know I love doing this. I hope you have a good night, guys.